When this young man visited the zoo with his parents, he had no idea that his day would get so bizarre so quickly. And it all had to do with this specific polar bear. The large animal kept following and imitating the boy. But nobody realized the reason why. It's until the animal did this. Polar bear keeps following boy. Pay close attention to what the animal does next. The 11-year-old Oscar had been looking forward to his zoo visit for weeks. He had excellent grades on his last school reports, and his parents promised him a lovely day with these animals. And now that day had finally arrived. They got in the car and drove. But they weren't prepared for this. During the ride, and even up until the point when the family walked below the zoo's entrance arches, Oscar bombarded his parents with facts about these animals. The boy had done research properly. But no amount of knowledge could have prepared the boy for what he was about to witness. Oscar, his father, and his mother walked past the animal enclosures and found a disappointing but recurring pattern. The places seemed quiet because, during the day, most animals were sleeping. Well, all except one, it appeared. But because commotion was heard at the far end of the zoo. And for good reason. Oscar saw a large group of people wildly conversing with one another. The curious boy couldn't see what all the fuzz was about because the crowd was blocking the glass window of the animal enclosure. But as he moved closer, Oscar's cheerful voice was heard. "That's the polar bear enclosure." Within seconds after his discovery, the young Oscar started running, and before he knew it, he was in full sprint. His parents shouted at him to slow down and stay close to them. But their asks never reached the kid. He was just too damn excited. And that's when Oscar saw it. The young boy wiggled his way through the crowd and pushed the last row of spectators aside to make it to the glass part of the enclosure. When he reached this large transparent window, Oscar instantly understood why this animal enclosure got all the spectators. The boy's eyes grew large. The polar bear that lived inside was not just seen walking around in its walled home. It was swinging right before him. The large animal moved through the water gracefully and was extremely close to the spectators. Oscar moved to the window and pushed his nose against the glass. And to his surprise, the bear did the exact same. They were now nose to nose, with only the glass separating them. Out of pure instinct, Oscar moved his hand upward and started waving at the animal. And to the surprise of everyone watching, the polar bear did the exact same. Everyone there looked on in amazement. This was unheard of. A normal, unassuming kid had captured the full attention of this mostly wild animal. Right after that first wave of motion, Oscar's parents arrived at the scene. They witnessed the end of the first encounter, but much more was to follow. Oscar moved his arm down again and looked at his father and mother, who were standing right behind him now. They smiled back, giving their son the encouragement he needed to wave again with his other arm. And it was not a one-time thing because the bear imitated Oscar again. Just like Oscar, he used his other arm while staring at the boy perfectly the entire time. Everyone watching was in awe because of this spectacle. But they had not seen anything yet. Things would get more bizarre in a hurry. And not all of these surprises would be received as pleasant. The crowd surrounding Oscar was curious to see what the boy could make the bear do next. So, some of them encouraged the gifted child to act out a different scenario. Oscar nodded and thought deeply for a moment about what to do. After that, he started skipping past the glass barrier. He looked back at the bear that remained in place for a moment. But seconds later, the large mammal started following Oscar through the water and glided with the same skippy rhythm as Oscar's feet did. Their movements were identical, but there was a sad reason for all of this. For the onlooking spectators, this was just pure spectacle and enjoyment. It was probably the highlight of their visit to the zoo. But all of them did not realize that this polar bear acted this way for a reason. Even Oscar did not know the animal's deeper reason. But he was about to. As Oscar passed the glass window, he eventually reached the far corner of the enclosure. The glass window ended at this spot, and fenced borders continued deeper into the animal's housing. That fact was important because as Oscar stood at this corner, the polar bear moved out of the water and onto land. Oscar watched curiously as the large mammal moved her heavy, wet paws through the dirt. The boy was still smiling at this point and waved, thinking the polar bear would imitate him again. But that didn't happen this time. The bear nervously walked past the fenced area of its enclosure. It walked forward and backward a couple of times and did something very unexpected. The polar bear twisted multiple times, moving its body in circles like it was trying to catch its tail. After that, the animal sprinted to the corner in the far back of its enclosure, and there it stopped. Oscar's parents and the onlookers were slowly moving to Oscar's location. But the curious boy urged them to stay at a distance. Miraculously enough, all of them listened. Probably because they thought he had some sort of special bond with the animal, giving him some form of authority. Kevin watched as the bear sat on its behind and started growling loudly. It was as if the polar bear wanted to communicate something to him. Curiously, Oscar started walking in the direction of the bear. It was a narrow passageway that led between two animal enclosures, and the bear was at the very end. The crowd respected Oscar's request and stayed at the beginning of the corridor. They saw how the young and brave boy inched closer to the large white-furred animal. Everyone was curious to find out what was about to happen. But nobody expected panic to arise from this interaction between the boy and the animal. After a slow walk up to the corner of the polar bear enclosure, Oscar finally reached the bear's location. During that short trip of just 100 feet, the bear continued her growling noises, trying to lure the curious boy closer. But once Oscar reached the far end, he saw something that freaked him out. The frightened boy turned around for a moment and looked at his parents, who were curiously and respectfully watching him from 100 feet away. He did request them to stay back after all. But that curiosity would soon turn to fear once they witnessed why Oscar was so frightened. Oscar couldn't communicate with his parents from this distance, so he had no choice but to understand the situation on his own. He turned around, and when he did, he immediately let out a small scream. Because when he faced the corner of the enclosure, he stood face to face with the polar bear. But this time, no glass window or sturdy fence separated the two. Somehow, the bear had escaped its comfortable confinement, and the large creature was now standing in the park corridor, just as Oscar was. The bear growled, sending a loud echo through the zoo. "What is going on?" Oscar mumbled. As the polar bear's roars surged to the zoo's corridor, its message also hit the onlookers at the very end, and panic arose instantly. Because a wild animal of that size could do some serious damage, and this one was out on the loose. People scattered, and screams followed them. The only two people who remained were, of course, Oscar's parents. They also wanted to flee from the dangerous animal, but they wanted to do so with their son safely in their arms. So, with every bit of air in their lungs, they screamed for him to run to them. But Oscar remained motionless. Was he frozen in fear? Did he not hear them? His parents couldn't tell, but for the time being, he was still standing on both feet. A few minutes later, the zoo's owner came running in. He was warned about the situation by one of the panicked onlookers. He was also the main zookeeper, so when his parents heard this, they hoped he had the answer to solve this dire problem. But unfortunately for them, he was also stumped. He looked down the corridor at the scene between Oscar and the bear. His face turned pale instantly, which was not a good sign at all. The only approach the owner could think of was the same one Oscar's parents had. He moved just a bit closer because polar bears could cover large distances quickly, and the nervous men started to call out to Oscar. "Move backward to me slowly, boy." But then Oscar did something unexpected. Oscar heard both his parents' orders to step away and those of the zoo's owner. Yet he refused to move. At first, it was out of fright for the bear, but quickly, he found another reason to stay put. And Oscar was about to communicate what that was. The boy raised his hand and signaled. Oscar's fingers moved inward from fully stretched to flat on the palm of his hand repeatedly. It was a signal for the zoo's owner to come closer. "Please come here," Oscar spoke in a calm voice. The owner was hesitant and explained that this situation was dangerous. But Oscar didn't care. Oscar stated that there was something wrong with the polar bear and that the owner needed to take a closer look. What could the kid have found? It was a confusing and nerve-wracking request. But the zoo's owner had no choice but to come closer. Eventually, he reached Oscar's location. He looked over the boy's shoulder and saw that the bear was in a submissive state. It was lying flat on the ground, like an obedient dog would, and its head was stretched out to Oscar. The boy was petting the animal's head like it trusted the polar bear completely, which was amazing. But the polar bear wasn't acting like this for no reason. Oscar told the zoo's owner that he thought the bear was sad. And right after the boy made this statement, the polar bear proved it. The large animal let out high-pitched sounds, which indicated crying. It's indeed sad, but why? The owner asked. And that's when Oscar pointed at the backside of the enclosure. The worried young boy discovered a hole in the fence there. I think that is how the bear escaped and made it into the zoo itself. But I also think this is why the bear is sad. Can that be true? Oscar asked. The owner immediately freaked out as he saw the large gap in the fence. The parts around it were rusty and had not been maintained in years. I think you are right, Oscar, the owner confirmed. And while he agreed with this statement, the owner was already scanning the enclosure for something else. Oh no! I think I completely understand why this polar bear is sad, my boy, the owner said. This fence does not only prevent the animals from getting in the park, where the visitors are. It also is a barrier between the enclosures and the large open forest behind the zoo. But with that barrier breached, there is no way to stop the polar bears inside from escaping and fleeing into the forest behind my zoo. Oscar was a smart kid and instantly picked on the fact that the owner said bears instead of a singular bear. There were multiple bears inside this enclosure? He asked. The owner nodded with a sad look on his face. He then gave Oscar a heartbreaking message. The polar bear he was petting was a mom, and she had just last week given birth to 3 young cubs. But as I scan the inside of the enclosure, I cannot spot them anywhere. Oscar's eyes widened. You mean to say that her cubs escaped into the woods? Oscar asked the owner, tears forming in his eyes. The owner nodded and said that he was afraid. To confirm this even more, the large polar bear mom let out a sad sigh, indicating her sorrow. But we will fix this, the owner promised. Oscar squatted down and patted the mother bear on her head to comfort her. And while the young boy did that, the zoo's owner sprung into action. He grabbed his phone and called his team to plan a large-scale search through the woods behind the park. Everything went very quickly after that. Oscar watched as over 20 individuals marched into the forest with nets and all sorts of gear to find and capture these poor, lost cubs. They followed a carefully thought-out search pattern to localize the cubs as quickly as possible. While all of this was going down, Oscar remained in the zoo. He was with his parents again, but wasn't interested in seeing other animals. The young boy was too worried about the polar bear mother and her lost cubs. So he did the only thing he could do. Oscar sat on a bench close to the hole in the fence and stared at it, hoping for any positive sign. And after 1 hour of searching the dense forest, a sign did arrive, even though Oscar was still oblivious to it back at the zoo. One of the rangers heard a soft whining coming from a large bush. He instantly knew he found something, so he signaled his colleagues to join. They circled the bush. And after that part was done, they closed in with soft voices accompanying their approach so as not to scare the little cubs. The leaves were parted, and that's when they saw them. 3 little polar bear cubs, all bundled together. They were scared but unharmed. One by one, they got picked up. While this happened, one ranger left behind managed to fix the hole in the fence, making it sturdier than ever before. The last weld to the fence was made when, all of a sudden, the speakers in the park turned on. And Oscar heard his voice being called out throughout the park speakers. Could Oscar Martinez please come to the park entrance? Oscar shot up from his seated position and hoped that this meant that they found the polar bear's young. The boy ran as fast as possible while his parents tried to keep up. And as Oscar arrived at the park's gateway, a smile appeared on his face. The polar bear cubs were found and were unharmed. This was great news, and Oscar couldn't be more happy. Shortly after, the bear mother was reunited with her children, and Oscar could see the pure joy in her reaction. The owner also made Oscar a promise. They would reinforce and reinspect all animal enclosures to make sure no animal mother ever had to worry about their children leaving again. Also, Oscar had visitation and park entrance rights for the rest of his life because his connection with polar bear Bernie made this entire rescue mission possible.